A completely unsubstantiated rumor from Facebook reports that Vegan Gains has been forcibly removed from on stage at some kind of animal rights conference. I'll now read this unverified first-hand account, giving you a sense of its gravity and seriousness by using a hand puppet and putting on a silly voice to ridicule the source. That awkward moment when somehow Richard Burgess, aka Vegan Gains, who has some of the most oppressive garbage politics, got invited to a vegan influencers panel at a Veg Food Fest, then decided to publicly and disruptively shame a Veg Food Fest organizer during a Q&A on a separate panel for having been vegetarian for 5 years and not yet vegan. Pardon me. By repeatedly accusing her of participating in the rape and torture of animals while organizers and security guards tried to remove him. This is what happens when the movement as a whole continues to uphold trash while refusing to listen to or actively silences critical intersectional perspectives. If there is videotape, I haven't seen the videotape. I've only read this first account. If Richard is going to come forward and speak on the issue, I haven't heard him say anything about the issue. However, the question we have to ask ourselves in these situations is, what are we here for, guys? Why did we even hold a conference? If we can't be honest with one another at talking about the conflict between vegan and vegetarian within the animal rights movement, if we can't be honest with one another about, say, the conflict between veganism and reducitarianism, conservationists who still go duck hunting, all these issues, whatever they may be, if we can't be honest about it, why did I buy an airplane ticket to come here? Why did I pay for a hotel room? You know, real talk. If we can't be honest about this here and now, why are we here? And I think what you run up against is the assumption that people are going to be less honest in real life than they are here. You know, the safety of the keyboard, the safety of the computer screen, the safety of the internet. And I think that's putting things the wrong way around. I used to be a scholar of Buddhism, and I went to a very memorable Buddhist studies conference that was in part academic and in part monastic, which is to say Buddhist monks were invited, and the Buddhist monks were almost entirely just dead weight at this conference. They had no interest in the research being done in the study of Buddhism for the most part. But at one moment during the conference, there's a senior white British scholar called Professor Richard Gombrich who's up on stage, and a Buddhist monk comes to the microphone, and he asks a somewhat provocative, somewhat confrontational question. And Professor Gombrich can take the heat, and he's getting a little bit worked up in his reply. The man who was the head of the conference, the chief organizer, he comes out and tries to just end the discussion. He says, "Oh, we can talk about it later. We can talk about it like behind the scenes after the conference, like during the lunch break or something." And to his credit, Professor Richard Gombrich said, "No. Why did I come here? Why did I buy an airplane ticket and fly here and come here to this conference? What was the point of everyone gathering here if not to talk out this kind of issue?" And of course he was right. When else is a traditional Buddhist monk in full robes going to confront, a secular Western academic expert in the history of Buddhism and Buddhist literature, Buddhist philosophy, whatever you want to say? When are you going to have that confrontation? When are you going to have that Q&A period or whatever it is? When are those issues going to get talked out? If not now, then when? If not here, then where? Now, what he said at that moment is different from what I've just said right now. He was making basically the same point, but he talked about the fundamental value of democracy and the fundamental value of academia and the concept that in a democratic society, an academic institution exists for this kind of debate this kind of confrontation of opposing values, and not to silence them, not to split it up. He made an interesting statement of principle. And just one other example of a flashpoint in that conference. There was a white guy, I believe American, who stood up from the audience and made a slightly hostile point about the interpretation of a certain text. And it's a very well-known citata. It's a very well-known quotation from the ancient canon. And same guy on stage, Professor Richard Gombrich, he openly laughed in his face. He said, look, what do you mean? Like, I'm not reading that in English. I'm not relying on a modern translation. I read the original scripture. I read the ancient Pali. And he said in this case, he said, I was just rereading that this morning before I came to this conference. Are you joking? You're going to tell me? I think that guy was a little bit emotionally devastated by that. And I've heard a lot of stories about PhD students with that specific professor, people being kind of scarred for life by these kinds of confrontations. Very often in a conference, very often with that distance of the microphone and the audience and everything. And I think somebody who may be watching this video comes out of a science background or an architecture background or even a theater background. If you're going to have a writer's room, if you're going to have writers sitting around a table discussing what changes they're going to make to a script, you got to be ready to debate that. You got to be ready to speak your piece. But obviously, the type of people who study Buddhism, there's a self-selecting bias here in the sample. These are conflict-avoiding people. These are people who've been used to nothing but positive affirmation again and again and again, being told what you're doing is so wonderful. Just like veganism, you're going to save the planet, make the world a better place. And it's so great that you're doing this. They've only been getting positive feedback up to a point until somebody laughs in their face, says, like, what do you even think? What do you mean? You haven't read this book. I have. What's the matter with you? And actually, both of those conflicts, that really was what it came down to. Like with both the Buddhist monk and with the American guy in the audience, really what Richard Gombrich was saying was, I've read this book and you haven't. At one point, that exact same situation, he said to the guy in the audience, he said to the Buddhist monk that he had more respect for the Muslims because at least the Muslims would read the Quran. At least the Muslims read the sacred text their religion is based on, the Quran and the Hadith. They know what they're getting themselves into, whereas this religion of Buddhism in the 21st century, it's the blind leading the blind. Right? There's another layer to this parallelism, this construction. Because at that very conference, and then also the next time I met with Gombrich, man-to-man, face-to-face, I really confronted him about the fact that he still eats meat. He's not vegetarian, he's not vegan, he never has been vegetarian or vegan. And the question is, no matter how nicely you want to word it, what are you doing flying around the world going to conferences and sometimes talking about very fine points of doctrine concerning Buddhist ethics, about whether or not you can kill a mosquito or something. And you're killing and eating cows every day. You're killing pigs, fish, whatever. What's this? What does any of it mean if you can't take that basic step? Richard, in this case, he may be dead wrong. It may be that tomorrow some tremendously embarrassing video footage is going to come out of this, and we'll all have a laugh at how ridiculous it looks. But being wrong is something that happens to human beings once in a while. Sometimes you got a choice, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have control over it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's a decision you make, sometimes it's not. Being wrong is something that happens to human beings once in a while. At least Richard is keeping it real. A commitment to keeping it real, that's a commitment you can make, and it's a commitment you can struggle to keep. You can't ever make a commitment to never be wrong again. You can't make a commitment to always be right. When you're wrong, notice that you're wrong. Try to feel good about yourself. Because if you've been wrong about something, it's a sure sign that you're still learning.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.